Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, a shout-out special for some amazing investigative journalism.
If they see me, they're gonna kill me.
Exposing a thriving sex trafficking ring in Minnesota.
The more we dug into it, the more we started finding reports that Minnesota, here in the middle of the country on some major highways, is in some cases ground zero for sex trafficking.
In Iowa, a small-town newspaper puts its future on the line to reveal the relationship of a local police officer and a teenage girl.
If you can't stand up for a vulnerable teenage girl, then I don't think you have any business standing near a printing press.
The reporters in Puerto Rico, whose investigations brought down the governor.
We never expected something like this would happen. We just thought that there were so many things wrong with the governor.
And the brave journalist in Ukraine, who stood up to both Russia and to her own government.
Honest journalism is the best form of patriotism.
From the Law and Crime Network studios in New York City's Herald Square, this is Brian Ross Investigates. And good evening and welcome. Tonight, a shout-out Encore special. A salute to local journalists around the country and overseas, making their worlds a better place with powerful investigative reporting. Beginning with reporters at a television station in Minnesota who uncovered a startling problem made worse by local judges.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to U.S. Bank Stadium in downtown Minneapolis and to the Bowl of North and Super Bowl 52.
This investigation started because we had a Super Bowl here in Minnesota in 2018, and with that Super Bowl, there was a lot of talk about sex trafficking. So our investigative unit really wanted to go deeper on this subject.
A.J. Legault and his team at Care 11 TV in Minneapolis, St. Paul soon uncovered a shocking reality that had remained well hidden.
And the more we dug into it, the more we started finding reports that Minnesota, here in the middle of the country on some major highways, is in some cases ground zero for sex trafficking and people passing through, going to oil fields in North Dakota, or crossing from, a port in Duluth that has big ships coming in, heading down to Chicago and, some of your other cities through the heart of the country.
So that must have been quite a surprise for your viewers, certainly.
I think it really was. I bet you there was a lot of, really, in our backyard, kind of questions that pop up when we started exposing.
911, where's your emergency?
I need help.
What kind of help do you need?
There's 3 people trying to prostitute me.
And they brought the story to life with a focus on one 16-year-old girl who they called Jodelle.
If they see me, they're gonna kill me.
This is the police car camera tape of that young girl being rescued.
I want my mom.
She and her friend had run away from home in Duluth and fell into the hands of 2 men who began to sell them.
The girls were taken to this St. Paul motel. Room 229 is where Jodelle's hell began.
I had a knife put up to my neck when I was being raped.
We had some really poignant interviews, especially with a young lady who was willing to share some really horrific details of what happened to her and her experience to showcase why this was such a problem.
And how did you get those incredible police tapes of her as she was expressing her fear of what was going on?
Really, that took more work than just about anything else in this investigation because the police were understandably loath to release those. Eventually ended up working with the victims and she allowed us to share them. And in some of the other police videos, it was really just identifying key cases that had, made headlines across the state, in the months and years prior, but hadn't really been delved into with a really serious spotlight.
But what took this investigative reporting to a higher level was what Legault and his team discovered in area courts once the men responsible were brought to justice. Huge numbers able to avoid what was supposed to be a mandatory financial fine, with the money used to help victims.
When we analyzed 7 years of statewide court data, we found from 2011 to 2017 there were 196 traffickers sentenced, but 118 of them, 60%, had no prostitution assessment imposed.
And the more we kept pulling that string, initially we found, okay, judges aren't imposing these fines that are supposed to be mandatory and shortchanging victims of sex trafficking. Well, then we flipped it on its head. And we said, okay, what's happening with the money when judges actually do impose it? And when we did that, we found that the money that was by law supposed to be going for very specific things, taking care of victims, police, prosecutors, just for training, handle these cases. The money was missing, misplaced, misused. It was going into general funds, and it wasn't being used the way the law required. So we found that, and we kept digging on that. And then we found, in some cases, we found money going directly into a prosecutor's pocket as a bonus for getting convictions, which was maybe the most shocking thing we found.
And when the CARE 11 team sought reaction from the judges,
not a single judge in the state would talk with us,
including the judge who handled the case involving 16-year-old Joe Dell, whose abusers were convicted but not required to pay the mandatory fine.
We emailed Judge Merrick asking why the failure to fine. She refused to be interviewed, responding, "I do not comment on my cases nor on my decision-making process."
It's the kind of work that does not come easily or quickly.
This story took months to prepare before it ever went on air. And we're juggling other projects at the same time. But I spent weeks just in a records room reading through cases to get an understanding of how sex trafficking cases work as they hit our judicial system. Our unit has myself, it has producer Steve Eckert, who I know you know from his Dateline days.
What do you say to those stations that aren't doing this kind of work with that kind of investment and backing?
You need to give your crews time to do this kind of journalism, because this is what our job is. It's to hold people accountable. It's to shine a light in places that you're not going to be able to in a day.
And to help end a culture that has for too long tolerated cases like that of Joe Dell.
They're going to kill me because I'm there as no one else is.
Next, an Iowa newspaper, which also sought to protect vulnerable children, reporting on a local police officer involved with a teenage girl, a story that threatened to put the paper out of business.
The community is about 10,000 people. We cover Carroll and a pretty broad surrounding area. So we try to be neither the common scold or the blind booster.
The Carroll Times-Herald in Carroll, Iowa, was founded by Douglas Burns' grandfather some 90 years ago. Burns is the infant in this photo. And the pictures on his editor's wall tell a story of a local newspaper with great ambitions. This was Burns in the Oval Office after an interview with President Obama.
With the advent of the Trump administration and some of the fake news tropes, I know our investigative journalism is appreciated, and we do a lot of it.
But the cost of doing those stories can be high, as Burns discovered in a story about this Carroll police officer, Jacob Smith, that began with the tip that Smith was having a sexual relationship with a teenage girl. In Iowa, the age of consent is 16.
So there was nothing criminal with that relationship, but we thought it was the kind of involvement and activity by a police officer that the community should know about, and that most parents would find that kind of would find it very concerning. So we worked on the story. If you've read it, it's thoroughly reported. And the reporter that wrote it is very experienced. So we didn't, we vetted it as closely and as carefully as any story that we've ever published.
Officer Smith resigned even before the story was published and then filed a lawsuit against the Times-Herald.
So I'd never been sued before, and I wouldn't suggest people add it to their bucket list.
In the lawsuit, Smith alleged his reputation has been destroyed, his character and integrity forever castigated in the public eye, and his employability as a law officer severely damaged, if not totally ruined. And when you began your defense, did you consider a retraction or a correction to get rid of the lawsuit?
We did not, because we felt that we had the story, and that if we would surrender on this, Brian, that it would have a chilling effect on not just other media, but particularly other small media in Iowa. That we, if we caved on it for financial expediency, which I was given an opportunity to do that.
In the end, the judge dismissed the case, finding the article at issue is accurate and true, and the underlying facts are undisputed. But Burns says it took a year and more than $100,000 in legal fees to get that result.
That I knew full well that had we lost the case, that my career would have been over then, and that we would have had to sell the paper then for either financial reasons or credibility reasons.
And now Burns says he's been forced to ask for outside financial help in an unusual move, posting a GoFundMe page seeking $140,000 to cover all the expenses that came out of the lawsuit.
If you can't stand up for a vulnerable teenage girl, then I don't think you have any business standing near a printing press. So this was the proverbial hill you're willing to die on. And, I've been, even in doing this interview now and doing this conversation, or being involved in these conversations, I have trepidation that because of the spotlight being drawn on this case again, that, it could still hurt us.
At this point, any regrets at all about the decision you made to run the story and to stand up to the lawsuit?
I don't think I could have lived with myself if if we hadn't pursued the story. It was the right thing to do. This is why local ownership matters, because this is my community. I live here. I'm on the Library Foundation. I helped start the Carroll High School Foundation. I care deeply about this town, and I don't want this kind of behavior occurring here.
As of this week, the GoFundMe page has received almost $100,000, enough to keep going, but certainly not with any frills.
My salary right now is under $30,000 a year to keep the paper going, so there's not going to be any trips in the future or you're not going to have to come out here and do an investigative piece about how the money's being used, because it's going right back into journalism.
Putting good journalism ahead of profits. When we return, the small team of investigative journalists whose work brought down a governor. Back now with our shout-out Encore special, recognizing some great investigative journalism, including a small band of intrepid reporters in Puerto Rico whose work helped to bring about the resignation of the island's governor. When more than 100,000 people took to the streets in San Juan, Puerto Rico this summer, demanding the ouster of the governor and other local officials, it was the direct result of the work of a small team of investigative reporters at Puerto Rico's Center for Investigative Journalism, led by Executive Director Carla Minette.
We never expected something like this would happen. We just thought that there were so many things wrong with the governor and his closest advisors and officials that we thought that everybody had to know how they were talking, who they were talking about, and what was the tone that they were using.
And it all came in an almost 900-page transcript of an online messaging, a chat it's called, between the governor and his closest associates and advisors, documents turned over by a confidential source. The governor called one rival a whore. He wrote about another, "We must liquidate him today." One of the governor's deputies wrote about a frequent critic of the governor, "I am salivating to shoot her."
You would never expect something like that from a government official, about their own political party allies, about the poor people, about women, about LGBT community, about everyone. You wouldn't expect that. Just to see it in black and white, it was awful.
It must have been amazing to see it right there in front of you.
It was. We were speechless.
Their story came as the people of Puerto Rico were still trying to recover from 2 devastating hurricanes, and the snide comments from the governor and his cronies, Minette says, proved to be a kind of tipping point in the public outrage.
They just, in general, they talk in a very disrespectful way about the victims. And I think that hurt many people. Everybody here in Puerto Rico went through a lot because of the hurricane.
A former top aide of the governor wrote about the growing problem with dead bodies, quote, "Now that we are on the subject, don't we have some cadavers to feed our crows?"
The demonstrations
Within days of the group's publication of the governor's chats, the crowds began to form on the streets of San Juan, leading to some violent confrontations.
Tear gas was first deployed by police around 11 p.m., and that sent protesters running.
At first, Governor Ricardo Rossello said he had no intention of stepping down.
There are 100,000 people on the streets, politicians of all stripes, the President of the United States, all saying you need to go, that this is enough. You've said no. Why not?
Well, there's an important component about rule of law and democracy, and I respect that process.
But the protests continued, fueled by the ongoing reporting of the Center for Investigative Journalism. And then,
after hours of delay, Rosselló finally said the words these people had been waiting 12 days to hear: "I will be resigning."
I have to say I was not surprised. Everybody expected that to happen. We were expecting that to happen because he had no other choice.
But when it happened, did you feel like, oh my goodness, we caused this?
Well, you know, I don't see it as we caused this. I see it like as the people did their part. You know, we do so many stories that never have this kind of outcome. So I think it was the people's doing what happened in the end. You know, we are also citizens. We have families, we live here. And of course, we are concerned about the outcomes of this process. But we feel that socially it has been a great lesson for everyone in Puerto Rico and also for other countries and for other states and territories.
A lesson about the power of the press?
Yeah, definitely. The power of the press and the power of the people.
When we come back, a shout out for an investigative reporter who took on Russia and her own government. We continue now with our special shout out for reporters taking on the risks that are inherent with investigative reporting. And nowhere is that more true than in places not protected by the American First Amendment, like Ukraine. Nastia Stanko's career in journalism has already seen her called a hero, a traitor, and a liar. She's been on the front lines of war, been threatened with death, been held hostage, confronted both Moscow and her own government in Kiev. All of that at the age of 33. Given all the pressure and given the threats and the danger, you still want to be a journalist, given everything.
Of course, because, you know, when you live in such country as Ukraine, it's always, you always, you know, have this feeling that it's not boring. It can't be boring.
Now the deputy editor-in-chief of the Ukraine television station she helped to found, Stanko says she chose journalism as a teenager after seeing reports of a television cameraman for Reuters killed in Iraq by U.S. forces, which claimed his camera looked like a weapon.
It was 2003, as I remember. And I saw that it's very important to be in such dangerous places and say the people truth from such dangerous places, and I said, I want to be journalist.
And she did not have to travel far to find a war to cover. It came to her when Russian-backed forces turned parts of Ukraine into a war zone hotspot 5 years ago. And then she was taken hostage by the Russian-backed forces.
They took me to this basement with something in my head. I mean, it was like some coat because that I shouldn't see nothing where we are going. And of course, they said that maybe they will cut my head or something like this.
When Nastia was released after a few days, she was hailed as a hero for her courage under such trying circumstances. But then a few years later, when she produced this report documenting how Ukraine's own security services had their own secret prisons, the same people who had called her a hero now said she was a traitor giving the Russians ammunition to criticize the Ukrainian government.
The people of Ukraine should know that it's happened in Ukraine, and maybe it's not okay because it's illegal, you know. And I never thought that, for example, when we say this true, for example, this true can help our enemy. I think it's just ridiculous.
Stanko and her reporting team tracked down people who had been held in the secret compounds, who identified key details of the cells where they were held, and some of the people who served as their guards. And then Stanko confronted the top officials who had earlier denied the existence of any such secret prisons.
You see this as 10 people telling outright lies to the international organization because they were recruited by, for example, the Russian Federation.
Now with Ukraine at the center of attempts in the U.S. Congress to impeach President Donald Trump, Stanko has another big story on her hands.
We understand, and people of Ukraine understand that this is not about reform, you know? And it's very scary for us, of course.
But Stanko says it's no time to ease up, even as she faces new criticism that her reporting will only weaken the Ukrainian president and help the Russians. This is how Stanko put it when she was honored by the Committee to Protect Journalists with their International Press Freedom Award.
It's difficult to work when you are expected to choose between patriotism and professional journalism. Standing here in front of my colleagues from all around the world, I know this pressure is not something only we, Ukrainians, feel. It's pressure experienced by anyone who chooses journalism as their profession. But I also know that there is no need to choose. Honest journalism is the best form of patriotism.
In an era of government corruption, corporate misconduct, and the abuse of power, those words, spoken by a journalist whose colleagues have faced threats of imprisonment and death, those are the perfect words to end this special shout-out report. And that's our program for tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you back here next week.